Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a very special guest today, author of When Race Trumps Merit, How the Pursuit of Equity Threatens Lives. Heather McDonald, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Dan.
Yes, ma'am, anytime. So this has been kind of a weird period in human history, you know? It has been the case for most of it that just through necessity that a meritocracy exists because we've just been trying to stay alive, right? Now that we've gotten a little bit more comfortable, it seems like some of these weird ideas about how life should be fair have become people's guidestone, which is interesting to me because it's never really been that way before. And you've done quite a bit of work in this area. Can you tell me a little bit about your personal background and how you got into this kind of research?
Well, first of all, I would just say that if life should be fair, we should have a meritocracy. We should have people rewarded based on their actual accomplishments, not on the trivialities of race or sex. I never regard it as fair when I am given some opportunity, whether it's to appear on a panel or write something or be on a show, because I'm female, which I know happens all the time. I'm under no illusions about that, and it makes me sick. My sex is of no relevance to anything I might say, and being chosen on the basis of sex casts doubt on any legitimate qualifications or accomplishments I might hope to have, and that's the same for race. Race is not an accomplishment. Being gay is not an accomplishment. Being trans is not an accomplishment, and none of those identity traits, which are trivial and of no interest, should ever play any role in any employment decision, promotion decision, awarding of a grant, awarding of a prize, nothing. My background is I studied literature, I studied literary theory. I came to realize that was a horrible waste of my time because literary theory had gone so far into a really bizarre realm of thought. Studying literature, let me just make sure nobody's mistaking me. Studying literature is actually the greatest thing one can do. If you have the opportunity to do that in college or thereafter, I would highly recommend doing so because it will take you out of your petty, narrow, pathetically mediocre self into a much greater world. So I pursued literary studies for a while, and then eventually, out of not interested in becoming a lawyer, but I was interested in legal theory. I went to law school, and as I kept looking and observing what was going on in academia, because my aspiration still was always to be a professor of literature. There's no greater privilege, but academia got crazier and crazier with the rise of multiculturalism, of women's studies, identity politics, and I realized I simply could not go back in. I couldn't go home. So at some point I started writing about cultural matters, and I also started doing journalism for the first time in my life in the 1990s when Mayor Rudolph Giuliani took over the city in 1994 and embarked on a extraordinarily courageous and transformative crusade to bring the city back to law and order, to try to dislodge the welfare industrial complex, which he did fairly successfully, and to make the city livable again and live up to urban ideals. And I was part of a think tank called the Manhattan Institute that was seen as sort of the ideas laboratory for Giuliani. And it was a very exciting time to be writing. It was my start in journalism, and I would go to welfare offices and homeless shelters and high crime neighborhoods and talk with people on the streets or welfare clients or people in jails and prisons. And I got a firsthand education in conservative principles that I had not gotten in my years of elite education.
Sure, yeah. I think it's all this weird turn where we've kind of there's been a small but vocal minority attacking the epistemology of the West, and it seems to be rooted in this is-ought fallacy. Like, well, I think things should be my idea of fair, so they should be that way. But it's like it's not really reality. Like I'm 5'2". People probably aren't going to dunk a basketball anytime soon, and pretending like it's unfair or saying that it's unfair doesn't really change reality that much. It's very bizarre that we've taken this particular road, and I wonder from your perspective, why do you think that is? I mean, like my premise is always if somebody's trying to divide you or attack a particular epistemology, it's almost like questioning the character of a witness in a criminal trial. You know what I mean? You're not really talking about the facts so much. You're just trying to weaken the position on the periphery so you can, I don't know, maybe dislodge some people from that belief set. But I can't figure this one out. It seems very bizarre to me because it always turns into what my friend Chris Williamson calls a 360-degree firing squad, right? Because if you set these weird purity tests that have no basis in reality, everybody ends up being everybody else's enemy at some point. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, and that's always a delicious moment when the left turns on itself and you have the editor of the New York Times opinion page getting fired because he published an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton saying that Trump should consider using federal troops to put down the George Floyd race riots. And all the Black employees at the New York Times said that by virtue of just having this op-ed in the pages of the New York Times, their lives were at risk. And I'm sure that the editor who was sacked in order to placate the Black employees was fairly liberal. I mean, he probably was not as left-wing as the current young round of journalists, but it's very lovely to watch this happening. But I would say, Dan, it's the title of my book is When Race Trumps Merit. As I see it, the widespread attack on meritocratic standards today is overwhelmingly driven by the race problem in America. The country is understandably, many people still feel guilty about our appalling treatment of Blacks through most of our history, treatment that was wildly hypocritical given our founding ideals. It was gratuitously nasty, heartbreakingly cruel. But we are not that country today. We have gotten over that. And now it's the opposite. Now there's not a single institution that is not bending over backwards to hire and promote as many Blacks as possible. Our reality today is no longer white privilege. It's Black privilege. Our reality is not white supremacy and apartheid, just the opposite. But despite that, the racial disparities have not closed. We do not see racial proportionality in our meritocratic institutions, whether it's in a big tech firm, in the computer science or engineering department, or at a medical research laboratory, medical school, student body or faculty, or in a law firm partnership. And America is very uncomfortable with that fact. It doesn't want to discuss the inner city dysfunctional culture that is giving rise to those disparities, whether it's with regards to academic achievement or criminal offending. And so we've gone into this hysteria, blaming every mainstream institution for phony racism.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like it's one of a set of, I guess, ideologies that have built up activist industries around them. Third wave feminism is an example of that. Late term abortion and the continued, like, it's just pushing the bill a little farther, and the continued discussion of race and what I think is almost an entirely post-racial society. Nobody that I know, and I talk to hundreds of people from very different backgrounds all the time. Nobody cares about any of this shit anymore. It's my opinion is it is simply to, one, continue the division from the political class because they benefit from that. There's an old saying that solved problems don't get out the vote, which is a very smart thing to say, I think. But the other part of it is, I think it is just to, I guess, continue to prop up the activist industry so these people can continue to generate attention and money. I think that's really all it is. I mean, we saw it with BLM. None of the money went to any real cause. People were just pilfering, right? And we see this in everything, whether it's Susan B. Komen, they've had their issues. Planned Parenthood has had their issues and stuff like this. And I don't really care about the abortion issue. But what I do care about is affecting people's day-to-day lives and pitting people against each other in a manner that hurts our country ultimately, just so you can profit off of it. I mean, I know a lot of people that work in these industries, in the political class especially, and if there's no longer teachers unions, they don't have a job anymore. If there's no longer Planned Parenthood, they don't have a job anymore. If there's no longer BLM, they don't have a job anymore. So it's not about whether the issue is correct or not. It's just about sustaining their own personal life. And I think that's kind of fucked up, to be honest.
Well, you're making a structural argument that it's all about self-interest or perpetuating your group or your raison d'etre.
Mm.
That structural argument could be directed at the right as well.
Oh, sure.
You could
Yeah.
say the NRA is just, wanting to keep issues going, and or the pro-life group just wants to keep issues going. So I think that's overbroad as an explanation, because what group doesn't want to keep itself going? So I think that it is necessary to look at the ideology. And yes, it is definitely a race hustle. And I am sick of people saying I'm sick of Black leaders saying lower standards for us rather than we'll meet those standards. Or the reason we're not meeting these standards is racism, therefore lower the standards. People have to stop being cowed by that. But I don't think that this is simply self-interest, but that comes into play for every human activity. I think it's also ideological, and it is based on a particular outlook about the character of Western civilization and the character of American civilization.
Yeah, it's interesting. It is a broader point. You're right. It definitely happens on either side of any issue. I think that's personally, I would not conduct myself in that way because I don't think that's appropriate. But it is very ubiquitous. And to your other point, we've got about 25 years or so of data that pretty clearly state that the more egalitarian a society becomes, the more likely, for example, women are to choose more feminine roles for employment or whatever, right, in the home or whatever it is, and men are more likely to choose their roles. But there seems to be this, and it happens in race too, there seems to be this very broad disconnect between reality and the opinions or arguments made from either side. For example, on the issue of police killing unarmed Black men, if you ask somebody who is a registered Democrat and ask them how many unarmed Black people were killed by police a year, they'll say somewhere between 100 and 200. If you ask somebody who is a solid Democrat, right, who only votes Democrat, they'll say somewhere around 1,000. And if you ask a progressive, they'll say upwards of 10,000. The real number is 7 to 9, right? So these people are 10x to 1,000x multipliers away, orders of magnitude away from reality. And it happens, again, the more egalitarian a society becomes, the more likely people are to choose things that represent their biological programming. So why is this the battlefield? Why is the battlefield something that is so easily disproven? I don't understand. Like, it almost reminds me of 1984, where it's, in the end, the party would say that 2 + 2 = 5, and you would have to believe them because the logic of their position demands it, right? And the logic of their position obviously is that there is no truth. We tell you what's true. It almost seems like it's just social programming at this point because they are indefensible positions.
Well, they think they've got the truth. Again, we should step out of our bubble, as hard as it is to believe. I don't think anybody is deliberately saying, I'm going to put out a deception there. I think that the ideology clouds their vision, and they sincerely believe these things. As far as the issue of policing and race, it's both simple and complicated. It is truly stunning to hear these protestations of, say their names, Black Lives Matter, they're killing us, driving. Now we have knocking on the door, we're all Black, from the Ralph Yarl case. All of this is completely contrary to the facts. As you say, the police are not the ones that are responsible for the high death by homicide rate for Blacks. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun shootings at 25 times the rate of whites between the ages of 10 and 24. You'd think that would be a civil rights problem that the activists should care about. But they don't, because the people that are killing those blacks at 25 times the rate are blacks themselves, not the police and not other whites. And we are just terrified of talking about inner city pathologies, above all black on black violence. And so it turns out that the black activists have decided they'd rather throw in their lot with black criminals than black victims. And the reason that we're dismantling law enforcement across the board in this country is that it all has a disparate impact on blacks. That's why prosecutors aren't prosecuting the law. It's why many police chiefs have told their officers to not make arrests for turnstile jumping or trespass, because if they do so in a colorblind, constitutional, neutral fashion, they will have a disparate impact on black criminals, not because the law is racist, but because blacks commit crime at such a higher rate. And the activists have decided they'd rather protect those blacks than protect their victims, who are also disproportionately black. So it's bizarre, but it is also very simple, again, because we all have a guilty conscience and we feel like it is racist to talk about those problems in the inner city. I've been talking recently, some conservatives have said, well, a conservative donor will come up to him, this is a big podcaster, and said, well, I don't like it when you talk about race. That's racist. It's not. It's the facts. The facts are not racist. And the result of turning our eyes away from these problems is that they'll never get solved.
To me, it seems racist to ignore a problem because you don't want to sound racist. I mean, people suffer because of that. There is a direct and measurable effect of ignoring what's very clear data. And I think it seems very bizarre to me that people can't separate the statistics from somehow monolithing the entire black community. That doesn't make any sense. Like, men are stronger. That doesn't mean they're not strong women, right? Exactly. That seems very bizarre to me. Bill Maher actually pointed this out on his show last week, that the vast majority of homicides in this country are young black men killing other young black men, like 70%. It's a lot. I mean, it's not like it's 40% or 60 even. It's 70%. And you make a really good point. I mean, the vast majority of violent crime is committed by intra-race, I guess, in between two races. So I think it's like 83% of Latinos, 82 or 83% of whites, 85 or 86% of black people that get murdered are murdered by another Latino, white, or black person, right? That's just how it works, because we're surrounded by people who look like us for the most part in life. How I don't understand. I mean, I guess it's just race hustling nonsense, but how do we break through this? Like you said, to get out of your bubble. I talk to a lot of people that don't think like me on a pretty regular basis, and it is very difficult to have a conversation with somebody that's operating from a completely different set of information and facts that you are. And, you can point them to, well, here are the FBI statistics, or here's some good research on this. And, they will, kind of summarily dismiss it because it doesn't fit their narrative. I don't know how you have a conversation with somebody like that.
It's a really good question. I don't either. And I'm just going to point out that, yes, most violence is intra-racial between members of the same race. However, when you're talking about interracial violence among different races, and you're talking about black on white and white on black interracial violence, blacks commit 87% of all interracial violence between blacks and whites on the one hand and whites and blacks on the other. So this racial bathos that, says that black parents, that President Joe Biden says all the time that black parents are right to fear that their children will be killed by a cop or by a white person every time they go outside. It's just a lie. I mean, it's maybe to say it's a lie means it's deliberate. It's a complete falsehood.
Mm.
It's a complete untruth. You know, in Kansas City, where we had this Ralph Yarl shooting, blacks commit homicide at 9 times the rate of whites, but they die of homicide at 7 times the rate of whites because they're committing a lot of other people outside of their own race, unlike whites. So, but how you break through that, I don't know. I've experienced this myself. I've talked about policing and crime and race for one of my previous books, The War on Cops, at the Yale Law School. And the students there just came up with the most fantastical explanations for why one shouldn't trust the homicide statistics. You know, homicide statistics are the gold standard of all crime data. The bodies don't lie. You don't really hide the bodies. And true, a lot of shootings don't get solved because of the anti-snitching ethic, but they pretty much all get reported. And these Yale law students had explanations that somehow like it was as if white people are also getting killed, but they're not getting reported and things. It just didn't make sense. But the utter resistance to the actual facts was extremely high. And the really thing to be worried about is these are law students who are supposed to be moved by facts, and you know, now they don't have a client. If you're actually a lawyer representing somebody, you sort of have a right to pick and choose your facts. You can't tell lies, but you don't have to invoke facts that are against your case. But as a law student, you really should be open to empirical evidence, and these students just weren't.
You would think so. And to the point about having the conversations, I'm not convinced that the broader Black community believes this shit, frankly. So there was a poll done, I think it was early last year or late 21 in Oakland, where they asked residents, about 1,000 residents, whether they wanted more, less, or the same amount of police in their neighborhoods, and 83% said more or the same. Now, that's not what you would expect. I lived in Oakland for a long time. Well, I lived in Piedmont, but I worked in Oakland and San Francisco, and that's not the answer that I would have, based on what you hear in the press every day, what you see in conversations that are public. That is not the answer that I would have expected. But the reality is that, you know, Maslow was right about a lot of things. Like, people want to be safe and secure in their neighborhoods. They don't want to feel like they're under constant threat, and they don't really care who the threat is. It doesn't make it any better, or I don't know how you would frame that, but it doesn't make it better if you get robbed by somebody of your own race versus somebody of an opposite race. You know what I mean? You still got robbed. You still got assaulted. The crime is still there. People don't like that, and I don't see why that's such a hard thing to understand.
Well, that's kind of a conservative safe harbor that all of the anti-police rhetoric and ideology is coming out of protected white elites. But I'm going to throw some cold water on that. And I know those polls too. I mean, we've had Quinnipiac polls in New York City asking Black voters and white voters, do you want the police to be enforcing the so-called broken windows offenses, the public order offenses, quality of life offenses? And Black voters wanted that in their neighborhood to a higher degree than white voters. On the other hand, you just had Brandon Johnson elected in Chicago over the runner-up Paul Vallas, and Johnson is a longtime police basher. He tried to soften his rhetoric in the runoff election somewhat, but we've seen him revert to type after the latest of the flash mobs that took over the Magnificent Mile. This is hardly the first. Last year, there was somebody who was actually shot to death in Millennium Park at the so-called Bean sculpture there. And there's Johnson excusing this behavior and saying, oh, it's because these students don't have, or these youth, rampaging feral youth, don't have opportunities. Oh, give me a break. They all have smartphones. That's how they organize their flash mobs. These are not deprived youth. And he said, they don't have safe places to gather in their neighborhoods. Well, Magnificent Mile was perfectly safe until they came and started shooting each other. So the areas of Chicago that voted the most for Brandon Johnson, who had called earlier for defunding the police, were Black neighborhoods. So I think there's a divided consciousness there. There's, on the one hand, if you ask, yes, we'd like more police, but they will still often vote for the ideology of victimhood and the sense of, or it's just sheer racial solidarity. And a lot of groups have done that throughout American history. So that's a hard thing to overcome as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, we have these conversations and polls and things like that that show that people feel a certain way, but quite often they vote completely against their own self-interest, which is, I guess that's what happens when you have a popularity contest to decide who leads you. You know what I mean? That's one of the inherent dangers of that. In reinforcing victimhood, as this new dummy in Chicago did, it always ends with the same result, right? I mean, you empower that feeling, whether it stems from nihilism and not feeling invested in the community, or whether it stems from feeling like you're being oppressed. And once you feel like, once you get that injection of self-righteousness from a third party validation, then I think history shows that not only does the behavior continue, but it escalates, right? They become more and more emboldened and start doing crazier things, which I'm not sure how much worse Chicago can get, frankly.
Oh, it can get a lot worse. It can get to St. Louis level, or Detroit level, or Baltimore level, or Louisville level, or Memphis, or Baton Rouge. I mean, I'm always kind of amazed at the fact that the press pays so much attention to Chicago, but it is not even close to the highest per capita homicide rate in the country. It has, as a numerical basis, it has the highest number of homicides, but that's just because it's a large city. And I think it gets the attention because it does have still a very, very viable and gorgeous downtown.
Mm-hmm.
But frankly, Trump said would focus on Chicago too. It's not the case. Less sexy cities are far, far worse.
And do you think you're deeper in this academically than anybody I talk to? Do you think that the rise in crime and the results, which is mass migration of people from major cities, and corporations like Walmart leaving major cities, and CVS shutting down stores, and Walgreens shutting down stores, do you think this is having any impact on those communities who do vote against their own self-interest? Or do you think it's just because if you read CNN or the New York Times, the stories about Walmart shutting down stores in Chicago has been like, well, now Black people don't have anywhere to shop. That's the narrative. It's not that they're shutting down because they're losing on average $450,000 extra per year in loss, right, per store. That's not the narrative. The narrative is, well, Walmart's abandoning inner cities. Okay, maybe. Right. But why? What was the cause of that? And I don't know what news people really read, if any, anymore. I think maybe people just kind of casually get information these days. I'm not sure, just because corporate media is so distrusting, or just unworthy of our trust at this point. I'm not sure where people get their news anymore. I mean, I kind of look at everything and try to make an educated guess on what's reality and what's not. But I'm not sure that I do that for a living. I'm not sure people who just work 9 to 5 have the ability to even stomach any of that.
I know it's odd. One doesn't know when you're talking to any given audience what their knowledge level is. I'm very conscious that I'm in this conservative bubble talking to people that are pretty involved in issues, and you don't know how far back, how many steps back you need to take in order to educate people. I'm always amazed that the degree of ignorance at the extent of how racial ideology has taken over things. I see it every day. How can you not see it? As far as the store closing, yeah, it is astounding. And the reason that those stores are closing is because they would rather close and deprive their customers of their prescription drugs, their elderly residents of their access to their prescription drugs, than make arrests for shoplifting and be accused of being racist because the majority of people that they will be arresting are Black. Again, that's just the reality. It's not because the stores are racist or the laws are racist. It's because those kids in these inner city neighborhoods are not being socialized. They are not being given bourgeois norms of respect for the law. They're being sucked into a gang culture. But the Walmarts and the Starbucks and the Walgreens and other stores would rather just go out of business in that particular area than face the wrath of the New York Times, which went after Macy's about 10 or 15 years ago, because it too, its security guards, who were probably themselves overwhelmingly Black, were arresting Black shoplifters at a higher rate. And it was impossible to say, you could not say, but maybe that's who's doing the shoplifting.
Yeah, right. And it's that's how deep this weird relationship with race that white America has, the inability to just to tell the truth about things. I mean, if a retail store will deal with somewhere between 0.5% and 1.5% breakage through crime like theft and other stuff like that per year. So if they got to, I'm just being generous here, but let's say they got to 2% in Chicago, which is a low number, I think. That means that average store, those 4 stores they were running, were generating about $25 million in revenue each. So they shut down $100 million in annual revenue just so they didn't have to admit that Black people were stealing shit from their stores.
Right.
You know what I mean? That is fucking crazy. That's crazy.
We're running away from the problem. It is really amazing. And the question is how much worse is it going to get? And I write about medicine and, the sciences in the book, and it's just it is crazy. And people have to stop being cowed by being called racist. Our standards are not racist. Our civilization is no longer racist. It never really was. It was about many things other than race. It was not all centered around race. The 1619 Project is wrong on that. It's right on a very few things, but on the idea that everything in America revolved around race, there's a lot that did not. Now, there's a lot when we talk about how wonderful we were with entrepreneurialism and individual opportunity. I'm these days feeling we sort of do need to footnote and say, yeah, but see Blacks, didn't apply across the board. And the 1619 Project is right for bringing that out. But the conquest, the amazing entrepreneurialism, the amazing run of discoveries of patents that were developed starting in the 19th century through the 20th, cars, new farm implements, new ways of canning, new transportation, all of that, just this extraordinary outpouring of ingenuity and amateur tinkering, that didn't have anything to do with race. And the westward expansion didn't have anything to do with race. Obviously, we ran into Indian problems in both directions. But still, at this point, we have to stop being afraid of being called a racist.
I mean, think about, forget about the epistemological concerns about operating from the same reality, about how it even affects the people that aren't committing crimes that live in that area, and think about the culture that it is perpetuating, where people feel like a life of chaos and crime is a legit future for themselves, right? And I mean, consider the nihilism that's rooted in, where I just have to accept the consequences that I'm going to be in debt or in jail by 25 years old. So I'm going to go, quote unquote, get mine and do whatever I want. How do people feel on the left like they're doing anybody any favors by allowing that? If your child was being a dick, right? If your 3-year-old was being a dick and biting other kids or breaking things, you would not allow that. Nobody would.
Yeah. You raised the question, Dan, like, how do they believe this? They say the same about us. Let's just admit it. They will say, how can they not see that Trump is a fascist or a totalitarian? How can they not see that COVID was the worst catastrophe to happen to this country ever, and we needed to completely shut down business and have government run everything. They'll say that about us, but I do. So I'm always trying to say, look at,
Mm-hmm.
these things are balancing out, but I don't begin to understand it. They'd rather put up with dead bodies than say we've got to have law-abiding constitutional policing, and we have the capacity to change our culture. Now, let's not pretend that white culture is anything to crow about these days.
Mm-hmm.
It's breaking down along similar lines with the great rise in out of wedlock child rearing. The American drug habit is just sickening. There's something just hollow at the core of the American psyche today, that we have so many people trying to obliterate their consciousness. It's beyond belief. And it's not comparable in Europe. Certainly our crime rates are not comparable. And that's to a large extent because of our demographic profile. But the drug use is across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And the disassociation from work among a lot of working class, or should be working class, white males is very depressing. So, I think to a certain extent, no group wants to hear itself called out in public
Mm-hmm.
and criticized in public. So I'm very aware that it is, as I say, a violation of racial etiquette for me to talk about inner city Black problems. But on the other hand, I also feel that the hour is late. And as valid as racial etiquette would be as a general principle, what I see happening now on a daily basis to the institutions that I cherish and love is too catastrophic to obey those rules of silence any longer. Because if they're going to accuse every institution of being racist and they're tearing it all down on the grounds of racism, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to fight back with some uncomfortable racial facts that nobody wants to look at. For instance, 66% of Black 12th graders do not even possess partial mastery of the most basic 12th grade math skills, such as arithmetic or being able to recognize a linear function on a graph. 66% of Black 12th graders are not even partially competent in those. The number of Black 12th graders who are competent in basic 12th grade math skills is 7%, and the number who are advanced in math is so small as to statistically not even show up. When you have that degree of academic skills gap, it is preposterous to say that racism is the only allowable explanation for the lack of 13% Black engineers at Google, or the lack of 13% cancer researchers or physicists that are getting funded by the National Institutes of Health or the Department of Energy or the National Science Foundation. And Dan, I have to give you a head up. I have only 5 more minutes I can give.
Sure, no worries. That is deeply embarrassing for the richest country in the history of human beings. It is deeply embarrassing that a group that represents 13 to 16% of our country has been left behind. Is not the phrase I would use, because that implies that it's all on one group of people, or all on somebody. But pretending like the problem doesn't exist because you're uncomfortable having that conversation is, imagine yourself in a relationship and there's some, there's some gears to be ground, I guess, inside of your relationship, and you decide not to. Like, you know what? It's better off if we just don't talk about it. How often in human history has that worked out for anybody? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's a really stupid way to go through your life. What do you think? What do you think are some solutions for this kind of stuff? Right. I'm sure you talk about it in the book. So if there's stuff in the book where you give people advice on how to go have conversations or whatever, could you give me some insight on that?
Well, I think the most The strongest solution, the one that would have the most effect, but the one that's hardest to attain, is honesty and courage. As I say, people have to stop being terrified by being called racist. They have to stop capitulating to the race hustle. It's a hustle at this point. And they have to stop lowering standards in order to avoid disparate impact and achieve racially proportionate outcomes. That has to end. The difficulty is, how do you give people that courage? Now, a Republican administration could get rid of every disparate impact standard in the Code of Federal Regulations, would have to hold notice comment hearings. It could tell the federal science agencies and every other bureaucracy, a White House executive branch bureaucracy, get rid of disparate impact rules, do not reward institutions or hand out money on the basis of race or sex or gender identity, sexual orientation. None of these things are relevant. The statutes that embrace disparate impact rules would have to be changed by Congress. But there is things, and Governor DeSantis is showing that you can stand up to even academia, and you're going to be called a racist. You can stand up to the Let's Destroy Childhood Innocence lobby and say, no, I'm sorry, these books should not be in school libraries because they destroy childhood innocence, and that's what we are bound to protect. So there's things that politicians can do, but I think that people within our fundamental institutions, whether it's medical schools, science labs, classical music orchestras, opera companies, art museums, have to return to a sense of excellence and merit and stop lodging totally phony charges of racism against their own institutions.
Well, 3 academics just had a paper pulled this week, actually, for that very thing. I don't know if you followed that. I can't remember the institution. I'd have to look it up. But 3, it was University of Minnesota, I believe. Three academics there wrote a paper accusing the University of systemic racism, and then somebody rebutted with the actual data, and they had their paper pulled, which is interesting. You don't see that happen very often. I'm glad to see it happen, even if it's a one-off. Thank you very much for coming today. I know you got to go. Can you tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your book?
You can Google me, Heather MacDonald, MacDonald, and I have a Twitter account, which I don't even know what the handle is because I don't really run it. But if you do Heather MacDonald Twitter, it'll get you the account that gives me a lot of my recent writings. And then the book is When Race Trumps Merit, and that you can buy wherever you usually buy books.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate the insight and the conversation and what you're doing out there.
Thank you, Dan.
Yes, ma'am. And this is thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.